All right. So now we're going to talk about personality and then talk about Freud and NeoFreudians. So, what is personality? Personality is long-standing traits and patterns that propel individuals to think, feel, and behave in certain ways. And typically that's, like it said, a pattern. It's not like a mood or an emotion. To look at some historical perspectives, Hippocrates thought that you could determine personality by looking at the four humors of the body, which is basically like bodily fluids. So, yellow bile, I think that comes from the liver, is thought of as choleric, which is extroverted and goal oriented but also confrontational. Black bile, which comes from the kidneys, is melancholic. Melancholic is analytical temperament, but also kind of melancholy. Red bile, which is blood, is sanguine, which is talkative and enthusiastic. And white phlegm, which is like from your lungs, phlegmatic, is more relaxed and introverted. So obviously your humors do not determine your personality, but that's what they used to think. Franz Gall expanded on this, or kind of went a different way, but similar pseudopsychology by looking at phrenology. He thought that the bumps on your head showed personality. So, for example, if you had a bump right here, you might be like a really good friend. But if you had a bump, say, right here in cautiousness, you might be super anxious. So, obviously, again, not real. Wilhelm Wundt, who is the father of psychology, and Immanuel Kant expanded on the four temperaments. Wundt took Hippocrates' temperaments, melancholic, choleric, sanguine, and phlegmatic, and he put them on two axes. So one is unchangeable and changeable temperaments, and one is strong and weak emotions, in order to kind of like describe what's going on with those people. Then we come to Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is famous for his wacky ideas, but also because he basically started therapy. Even though he was wrong about therapy, he started the idea. So, important to note is that Freud was not a psychologist, he was a medical doctor, but he was the first to systematically study the mind and theorize the workings of the unconscious mind. He used something that is now referred to as the iceberg metaphor. So, he said that consciousness takes up about 1/10 of our mind, and that unconsciousness takes up about 9/10. So we're conscious of only about 1/10 of things, and then the rest is like unacceptable desires and urges and like animal instincts. He also came up with, he's known for the term Freudian slip. He didn't call it the Freudian slip, but that's what it's called now, which is an unconscious sexual or aggressive urge that slips out as a speech error. For example, here he might be looking at this girl's breasts and say, "I'm having the best time ever," when he means to say best, right? And he thought that that was a window into the unconscious, whereas psychologists now are like, no, we just get tired sometimes, and words that rhyme are easy to like substitute for one another. So in his iceberg metaphor, the conscious and the unconscious, Freud believed that we had three parts of our identity: the id, the ego, and the superego. Note that the id is not the ID. My brother always thought it was the ID, it's just the id. So the id contains our most primitive desires. Hunger, thirst, sex. It's like kind of like what we need to survive and procreate. The superego is the social rules of right and wrong. So that's like our conscious. And the ego is the rational part of our personality that balances the id and the superego. If you look here, we're only really aware of the superego and the ego, and then the id is kind of below the surface. So basically in this theory, the id and the superego are in constant conflict, right? Maybe I don't want to go to school, but I know that I have to. Too much of this leads to neuroses, which is the tendency to experience negative emotions due to conflict between this id and the superego. So too much id means you're basically a narcissist. Too much superego means you're probably guilty and denying yourself something. But if you don't have any superego, you are a psychopath, right? You don't care about rules. And then this kind of shows like, this is your id, this is your superego, and then this is your ego tries to make you adaptive to society. Freud also believed that when the ego is not able to mediate conflict between the id and the superego, you rely on defense mechanisms, which is kind of like a feeling of anxiety. And the defense mechanisms are used to reduce that anxiety. And we're usually unaware of when we use them. So, there are a bunch of defense mechanisms. We'll just go through each of them. First is denial, which is refusing to accept real events because they are unpleasant. For example, Kyla refuses to admit she has an alcohol problem, even though she's unable to go a single day without drinking excessively. Displacement would be transferring inappropriate urges onto a more acceptable or less threatening target. During lunch at a restaurant, Mark is angry at his older brother, but does not express it, and is instead verbally abusive to the server. So it's more acceptable to or less threatening at least, to verbally abuse the server than his brother. Projection is attributing unacceptable desires to others. So here, Chris often cheats on her boyfriend because she suspects he's already cheating on her. Rationalization is justifying behaviors by substituting acceptable reasons for less acceptable real reasons. So Kim failed his history class because he did not study or attend class, but he told his roommates that he failed because the professor didn't like him. Over here, reaction formation, which is reducing anxiety by adopting beliefs contrary to your own. Nadia is angry with her coworker Beth for always arriving late to work after a night of partying. But she's nice and agreeable to Beth and affirms the partying is cool because she doesn't want conflict. Regression would be returning to coping strategies for less mature stages of development. So, for example, after failing to pass his doctoral exams, Giorgio spends the day in bed cuddling his favorite toy, or maybe he throws a tantrum or whatever. Repression is not acknowledging painful memories and thoughts. So, Lachey cannot remember her grandfather's fatal heart attack, although she was present. And then there's also sublimation, which is redirecting unacceptable desires through socially acceptable channels. So Jerome's desire for revenge on the drunk driver who killed his son is channeled into a community support group for people who've lost loved ones to drunk driving. We also kind of went over this last unit, but Freud does have five stages of psychosexual development. So again, he believes that first you go through oral stage, 0 to 1, the kind of erogenous zone. The zone in conflict is your mouth, and the major conflict is weaning off the breast or bottle, no more milk. And that if an adult doesn't mature properly through this, they might be a smoker when they grow up or overeat because they have what's called an oral fixation. Next stage is anal. Anal is 1 to 3. The erogenous zone is the anus. And the major conflict there is toilet training. And so someone who is anal retentive, for example, could be seen to have an anal fixation, right? They need to be neat all the time. I think the other one's called anal explosive, which sounds terrible, but that's too much messiness. Phallic is 3 to 6. That erogenous zone is the genitals, and the major conflict is the Oedipus or Electra complex. So the Oedipus complex is the son wanting to kill his father and love his mother. The Electra complex is kind of described by penis envy. Freud thought that girls were just inherently jealous because they didn't have a penis. And the adult fixation there is vanity or overambition. Then there's latency where nothing happens. And then there's genital phase, which is 12 or older, which is basically where you become a sexual human. All right. So that was Freud. A lot of his stuff was discounted, but it served as the foundation for a lot more. So NeoFreudians are people who were originally inspired by Freud, but then created new theories about personality. They mostly agreed about the importance of childhood, but they weren't as into the sex stuff, and they focused more on society and culture. So Alfred Adler was the first. He founded something called individual psychology, which focuses on our drive to compensate for our feelings of inferiority. From that, he coined the term inferiority complex, which refers to the feeling that one might lack self-worth. And he also believes that social connections are more important in childhood than Freud acknowledged. He also said that there are 3 social motives that kind of push us through life. One is occupational tasks, the next is societal tasks, and then love tasks. So you have to find a career, you have to have friends, you have to have a partner. You don't have to, but that's what people are driven towards. One of his major contributions is that birth order shapes our personality, which has yet to be really proven, but there's definitely a correlation there. Next was Erik Erikson, who you know well from development. He was a NeoFreudian. He came up with the psychosocial theory of development. He actually learned a lot about psychoanalysis from Freud's daughter, Anna Freud. And his theory suggested that personality is developed throughout the lifespan, whereas Freud believed it was fixed. Also, if you look at the comparison of their stages, Erikson is a little bit more, reasonable and not sexual. Then you've got Carl Jung. He was a student of Freud, but he later split off. He looked at analytical psychology. So he worked to balance conscious and unconscious thought, or he believed that we're always working to balance conscious and unconscious thought. He had 2 main disagreements with Freud. The first is that sex is not the primary motivator, and the second is that our unconscious isn't just personal, there's also kind of like a societal unconscious. So he developed something called the collective unconscious, which says that there are mental patterns and memory traces that are common to all of us. And within that are the archetypes. So there are universal themes in culture like the hero, the shadow, the self, right? And that we're all linked through those archetypes. The persona, he said, is the mask that we adapt in society, which is derived from the conscious and unconscious. It's kind of a combination of who we are and also who society expects us to be. Carl Jung also proposed 2 attitudes towards life, extroversion and introversion, which we know well. He said that the balance between the 2 is the best for self-realization. Then our last Neo-Freudian that we'll look at is Karen Horney. She was the first woman trained in psychoanalysis. She agreed about Jung's self-realization hypothesis, but she disagreed with Freud's idea of penis envy. In fact, she said, if anything, it's the other way around. She focused on unconscious anxiety and the 3 forms of coping, so moving towards people, moving against people, or moving away from people. So for example, moving towards people might be a child seeking positive attention or an adult needing love. Moving against people is fighting or bullying, and then moving away from people is kind of withdrawn, and that those 3 things help a child cope with childhood and then affect you later on. There we go.